Again, just really struck today by the visits that I've done now to 2 civil defence facilities and units to see amazing volunteers doing incredible things. Struck by some of the volunteers have actually had challenges with their own living circumstances and are still wanting to serve and help. And you're just seeing literally the best of New Zealand happening across the response. So, our thoughts are really with people who are doing it incredibly tough across New Zealand at the moment. We think about the families that have been displaced from their homes. We think very much about the communities that have been disconnected and are cut off and still don't have communications to the outside world. We think about some of the heroics we've seen with our first responders. And yesterday I had the privilege of being in the bunker in Wellington and just seeing emergency management teams that just have been working tirelessly and endless long hours, just making sure things are coordinated, and then volunteers here again today across Auckland just doing amazing things. So, really encouraging, but obviously our real focus is on making sure people are safe and obviously also making sure that people feel supported and that we start the clean up and then can ultimately move through to the phase of recovery that comes. So with that, happy to take your questions. Yeah, look, I managed to get back to Auckland late last night myself, and I was conscious there was 50 people that had come in from the airport late last night, talking to, again, some of the people who had come in from Muriwai or from the airport today. They just felt incredibly supported. I mean, they were blown away by the fact that even just as you've seen here, the triage system to make sure people are getting what they need, and as soon as they walk through that doors that they feel love and support, and it's a place of refuge and release, and that's been really special to see. So, they've been blown away by the fact that they can, if they're tired, they can go have a sleep. There's a fantastic kitchen and food operation out there as well, and amazing volunteers doing incredible work. So, it's been awesome that we've got a large format like this. This is what I've experienced in the US in disasters there or emergency weather events as well, and I think this format actually works incredibly well. Well, look, I think as we head to the recovery phase, we've really got to be able to come together and actually say, look, this is an extreme weather event caused by climate change. Be under no illusions about that. And what's important now going forward is that, we're going to have multiple governments over multiple decades of different colours that actually need to be able to work on a complex issue, which is actually climate adaptation and infrastructure that needed to support that. That needs to be a bipartisan effort across all political parties. All countries around the world are struggling with how you do that because it's actually very, very complex in terms of how do you get the balance right between insurers, individual property owners, councils, ratepayers, taxpayers as to how you fund that infrastructure. Is it this generation, is it future generations, and how you get that balance right. And so actually working together on a framework that actually gives us a platform to be able to move forward over decades, starting in the recovery after this event, I think is going to be very important. Yeah, look, I mean, I think they're different by different regions, to be honest. What we're seeing in the images, and you think about the 1,000 people displaced in the Hawke's Bay, 1,000 people displaced in the far north. What we've seen here in Auckland, we've probably got about 1,500 homes that are actually either yellow stickered or red stickered. And so they're different issues in different places. And that's more, again, for local councils and local government also who know the geographic hazards. They know the area better than anybody. This is a good example. This facility here was actually raised, and the decision was made by a local government council to say, hey, there's a creek over here and a river over here that could flood. This is going to be a very useful facility. It needs to be elevated. And so they built this in an elevated way, and as a result, we now have a fantastic facility to manage in these circumstances. So they are different by different areas.
With these big infrastructure bills, are you still going to be able to deliver the kind of tax cuts that you were signalling management would be perhaps going to the elections?
Yeah, look, absolutely. What we're talking about is inflation-adjusting tax thresholds, which we think is just entirely fair, done in many countries around the world, and is a completely reasonable thing to be able to do to give people more of their own money to navigate a cost of living crisis, which is the other big challenge. We've got some real economic challenges going forward. What we've got to make sure is that we do a proper assessment of what the damage actually is and what support's really needed, and then we make sure that we apply those funds with good economic responsibility, and we're prudent economic managers, because because it's taxpayers' dollars, and most importantly, we actually get things done. We've got a lot of examples where it's important that we actually deliver stuff. We don't actually just talk about stuff, we actually get stuff done. And when you think about some of the roading projects that we've got that have been on, off, and actually need to be committed to, locked down and actually delivered, that's really what I'm focused on. So be under no illusion, we've got a multi-decade program, as every other country around the world dealing with climate change will have as well. It's important we do that in a bipartisan way with a clear framework, but we also have to be really smart with the money, and then most importantly make sure things get done. That's the frustration I think that I sense in parts of New Zealand, is that we've been talking about some roads that we know are dangerous, that aren't up to spec, that we need to have invested in. We know that there's some infrastructure, we've got to do that. So let's focus forward and let's get it done.
So how are you going to getting the numbers balanced up, I guess? You've got these bigger bills that are achieving.
Yeah, well, I'll be really honest. I think over the last 5.5 years, we've had a government that spends $1 billion more each and every week than it did 5 years ago. And we haven't got better outcomes as a consequence for that, whether it's economic outcomes, crime, health, housing, education. So I personally think it's not just about the dollars, it's actually, as a former CEO who's used to spending money and making investments, it's about what you do with that money and how you get a return on that and how you actually get things done that deliver benefits for New Zealanders. And so that's really the focus. I think there's still a lot of waste that's happening, a lot of spending that's poorly directed, poorly prioritised, and we've got to make sure on behalf of the New Zealand taxpayer, hard-working people it's not the government's money, it's taxpayers' money, that we actually do the right thing for them and actually put the money into the things that make the biggest difference to them, to the most amount of people in the fastest amount of time. That's. Oh, I think it's been good. The government's doing its job, which is exactly what we asked the government to do. And as I said yesterday, it was fantastic to be able and privileged to be able to sit in the bunker in Wellington, and there's 200 people working in there. They've been working incredibly hard. Having come from an industry where there's a lot of emergency management process around, that's been really fantastic. So, it's been better. It's been good to see improvement. If you think about the response this time with the advance notice that everybody had, get prepared. Talk to your neighbours, know what you're going to do in an evacuation plan, get your sandbags in place. People had plenty of warning and time to be able to do that. Compare that to, say, what we saw a couple of weeks earlier with floods. Sorry.
How much is this going to cost, do you think? You must have had a number of countries doing that.
Not yet, because actually we need the event to pass and actually do the assessment. And as you're seeing in places like Wairoa today and Hawke's Bay, which we are so cut off and there are no communications to, it's very hard to get a full picture of what that assessment actually is at this point in time. The focus has to be on making sure Kiwis are safe, making sure we're supporting them, making sure we start the clean-up, and then obviously making the assessment of what's needed.
Could this bankrupt us, though? I mean, it's a third in a couple of weeks.
Look, no. I think the reality is, we'll be able to find our way through it, but we do need a good assessment of what's happening. I think when I talk to insurance companies, they seem to be well prepared with reinsurance backing, which is good. They're suggesting that maybe there is a challenge around building and construction, and also getting the building and construction workers, and so therefore the rate by which they'll be able to get remedial work in place could be challenged, and it's just managing expectations a little bit around that. But again, we need workforce, in the building and construction sector. We're going to run out of building supplies, I suggest, in some parts as we rebuild things back. So there's going to be some real practical challenges we've got to work our way through, but we've got to be able to get to the most vulnerable New Zealanders, make sure they're feeling supported in the fastest possible way.
How will the recovery be, do you think?
Oh, look, I mean, as I said, I think it's also a chance for us now to start a conversation about a multi-decade investment in climate adaptation, and so that will go on forever. In the sense of there are regions of the country that are vulnerable, that we need to be able to make sure we shore up and work out what we're going to do there, and how we help people.
Is it all about a conversation? Do you think there should be like a committee that will actually specifically look at this issue going forward?
Look, I think what I've offered is we want to work in a bipartisan way, because this is a New Zealand issue. It's not a political issue per se. About making sure we've got good, resilient infrastructure in key parts of New Zealand that are vulnerable. That's the offer, and that's what I think needs to happen from a country point of view. I want to make sure that money is incredibly well spent. We spent, I think, something like $15 billion on the Christchurch earthquake. We spent $75 billion on a COVID, challenge. So, I want to make sure the money is well spent, and people can be reassured they're going to get a good outcome and a good return for that investment. So that's what I'd be focused on at this point. But it's way too early to say. We need a proper assessment of the damage done to homes, livelihoods, and to businesses.
Is it reality now that places like in Gisborne along the river and the coast that are completely underwater, particularly we're seeing, twice, roads closed, inaccessible, that maybe we just can't live in these places anymore and we need to move there?
Yeah, I mean, those are the conversations, as I say, that I'm talking about that we've got to have over that multiple decade period of time, because, and it's a range of solutions and problems that are actually needed to be able to have that conversation. And again, how you manage that conversation between, as I said, insurers, private landholders, councils, and central government is actually the real complexity to all of this, and over multiple generations. And so that's the work that we need a framework on, that we can work on in a bipartisan way to deal with.
Have multiple generations to adjust to that, given in 2 months we've seen 2 events hitting West Auckland?
Well, look, I mean, I think what this event is an opportunity for us to move with greater speed through actually making sure we've got infrastructure resilience, also make sure that we actually are upgrading our emergency management responses. As I've said before, I lived in the US for 6 years, and I saw after Hurricane Katrina, which was a poorly managed emergency response, I saw how the different states individually really upgraded their responses to similar events like this. And so we've got great communities outpouring, and you've just seen the best of New Zealand. I think we're the best in the world at that, and the community comes together and just mucks in and gets it done. But we also do need to make sure, right, well, where are we going to? Large format events like this here. We actually got supplies on stock here all the time, so that if something happens quickly, people know this is where you head to, and they can be served. 5,000 people can be served here in theory. So, that's the sort of stuff we need to get better at, and we are. You've seen a better response this week than I think last week.
Just recently, the Civil Defence Minister has updated the figures on evacuations, 9,000 now displaced. How do we respond to numbers like that? What can we do as a country to respond to that?
Well, look, I mean, that's incredibly challenging, and what has been excellent to see is that the government agencies are all here in this building as well upstairs, offering, making sure they can get people supported, re-accommodated into transitionary housing, the social housing organisations where I've spoken to, a number of them across Auckland here, they have some capacity and they've been able to make accommodations in the short term as well. But it's an incredibly challenging situation, but you actually have to deal with each individual case. Some cases are people will be able to return to their homes. Some people, the properties need to be assessed. Others actually will need to be accommodated in transitory housing. Yeah.
Has had a gutsy this year because of the weather. What priorities for the national government, if the government, for Tairāwhiti region?
Yeah, well, Tairāwhiti is a region that I really do support an independent inquiry into actually what's happening with land use and forestry practice. I think what we've seen is, when you think about all the slash that's come down through down through our rivers, through the rivers there, and actually I think we do need to ask some really good questions about, well, actually you can't just manage your waste that way, as a sector or as an industry. And so what has actually happened within the forestry sector? If any other sector or business treated their waste in that way, where it's actually the cost is socialised rather than you get the revenue but you've actually socialised the cost, that's not a good outcome. So I think there's a good question to ask there. And obviously locally on the ground, what is the right land use to make sure that we're not losing high quality soils? We lose a lot from that area, and obviously what's the right sort of planting we need on those hills that are very close to the sea as well. So that's the kind of, I think the local folk on the ground, talking about an independent inquiry is something that we would support.
A lot of businesses are relying though on State Highway 35. Should wonder what they actually provide more assistance in upgrading, roading?
Well, we have major challenges on roading across the really most impacted areas. I mean, I was talking to Scott Simpson yesterday, our Member of Parliament for Coromandel, and a huge amount of roads down there and access really constrained and limited. It's going to be the same in Tairāwhiti, the same in potentially Hawke's Bay as well. So that's the conversation we need to have, is when we build back that infrastructure, how do we make sure it's just not wiped out in the next extreme weather event, that actually we're building more resiliency into that infrastructure as well. So those are the conversations that I'm talking about that we've got to have in the coming months and years.
The
bipartisan agreement on infrastructure that you were kind of talking about, can you tell me a little bit about what you mean? Are you talking about maybe an agreement on a pipeline for the next few decades? Or?
Well, what I mean by that is, really clearly, what we have is, climate adaptation is a major challenge. Yes, there's climate mitigation, but there's climate adaptation. And, an extreme weather event like this just highlights it's going to be a multi-decade effort. You're going to have multiple governments of different colours, as I've said, and actually what you want is a really bipartisan, joined-up framework and approach to that. So it doesn't change with different governments going in and out, that there's actually a common understanding and a framework for how we are going to manage climate adaptation and the investment needed for that infrastructure. It is deeply complex. There is no country on planet Earth that has actually cracked this. It's really hard because as you think about areas that are vulnerable, you've got to ask, where does the burden sit? Is it a mix of individual property owner? Is it actually insurance companies? Is it the local government and ratepayer? Is it the central government and taxpayer? Is it how much is funded by this generation versus future generations? So they are very, very complex issues. They're not easy to sort through. But what we want is alignment around that. In the same way you've seen a National Party be very aligned working with the government on net carbon zero 2050. It's something we support. We want bipartisanship on the approach to how we actually would do infrastructure management and around the climate.
So are you talking about alignment on projects or the principles?
First of all, we've got to work up the framework, and the framework is really about managing some of that complexity about who pays and how it's funded and all of that stuff, and getting that agreed and aligned. Working out the projects then is the next level of detail, and making sure that they're the right projects that have the biggest impact, that will make the most difference in the fastest amount of time. That's in some ways an easier conversation, frankly, than actually getting the framework right and the settings right for future infrastructure investment in that space.
Are you envisioning that both parties, including the government, will have to take on more debt as a result of this?
Look, I honestly think you've got to do a proper assessment of what the challenge and what the size of the cost actually is here, and until we can do that proper assessment, that's largely unknown. As I've said to you, I also think the government has been terrible economic managers over the last 6 years, and a dollar is not a dollar. It's spent differently by different governments who have different ways to get a return for that dollar. And so it's not just about the dollars being spent, it's actually what it's being prioritised on, what it's delivering, and what outcomes are being achieved for that investment. And that's been what I've been arguing is the fundamental difference between how a national government wants to run the economy versus what we've seen with the Labor government.
But that money has been spent, right?
And it's been spent really badly over the last 6 years, if we're really honest, right? I mean, there has been no big wholesale investment in infrastructure over the last 6 years, and so that's why I'm saying going forward, we've got to get that aligned so projects don't just get turned on and off by successive governments coming in and out. There are key roading projects that we actually know are safety projects that should be done, that should have been delivered, that haven't been delivered. And so without getting in, it's not a time for politics this week, but those are the conversations we've got to get into and say, I think we've got to run an economy well, we can actually manage and help people through the cost of living crisis, and we have to, over the long term, make sure we're making good infrastructure investments as well.
So if it's been spent, then how are you going to make up the difference in terms of the extra spending?
Well, at the moment, we spend $1 billion a week more than we did just 5 years ago. And New Zealanders have to ask themselves the questions, have we got better health outcomes? No. Have we got better education outcomes? Absolutely not. Have we got better crime outcomes? Definitely not. Have we got better housing and infrastructure outcomes? No. And is the economy going forwards or backwards? It's going backwards big time. So, I think there's a different way in which I would deploy that money relative to how this government does that. All right. No, I've said to you very clearly we're going to continue to invest in health and education more at each and every year of a national government. But as a former CEO who's used to getting return on money and actually getting outcomes delivered for people, what we're seeing at the moment has been incredibly frustrating to see an economy that actually is spending, taking on huge amounts of debt, $1 billion more in spending each and every week, and not getting a return for that investment. I think there's a lot of waste in the system that we could better deploy to get outcomes for New Zealanders. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate your time. Okay.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all the latest news from the New Zealand Herald. Click the subscribe button below or check out one of the videos here, and head over to nzherald.co.nz for more details on these stories and more.